I understand that there is a lot of resentment towards the US for its consistent flouting of international law to justify destructive foreign policy cowboy adventures, which are then marketed by Hollywood as heroic action movies. But I think it's also important to remember that Allah in the Quran says that never let hatred of anyone lead you to deviate from justice. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا. I think that when it comes to this war in Ukraine, it's important to remember that Putin's assault has huge ramifications for the likes of Bosnia, which is facing a restless Serbia that is once again beating the genocidal drums of violent secession and working itself up into a frenzy of bloodlust that Moscow has firmly supported and protected for decades, and protected even during the 1990s when the genocide was being implemented in Bosnia. If Putin wins, then what we will see is a rebalancing of the power in a way that presents a situation far worse than it is at the moment. For all of NATO's flaws, it's important to remember that it was NATO that ended Serbia's genocidal campaign, and whatever reservations there might be over the Dayton Agreement and the awkward peace that it created afterwards, Russia wouldn't even have brokered the Dayton Agreement and would have encouraged Mladic after his genocide in Srebrenica to continue with his ethnic cleansing measures in Bosnia. Putin has grievances over NATO's expansion. Many people have talked about that, and he sees NATO's getting closer to his border. Ukraine joining NATO would be a nightmare scenario for Moscow and a nightmare scenario for Putin. In abstract, this is reasonable for Putin to have these grievances. But the reason he has these grievances is that NATO chains his dreams of reimposing a Russian power that was averse to everything remotely associated with freedom. Putin romanticizes a historical Russian power that brutally pursued assimilation of populations by using the overwhelming power of the state and its security apparatus in attempts to wipe out entire community identities, to wipe out religious beliefs, to wipe out freedom of thought. This may not be the reason why the US is expanding NATO, but that does not change the reality in terms of the fact that NATO acts as a check on Putin's nostalgia for something that can only be described as dark, even when trying to be polite. Moreover, the parties in Ukraine should not be judged by how they treat others, but how they treat their own. When Ukrainians compare how Putin treats Russians in terms of dubious elections that always produce the same winner, imprisonment of critics, restricting the media and the like, when they compare how Xi Jinping treats the Chinese with re-education camps, arbitrary charges against opponents and the like, and when they compare it to how US and Europe treat their citizens, there is no comparison in the eyes of the Ukrainians. NATO is hardly an alliance of shining knights by any stretch of the imagination, but the reality is that this has little bearing in judging the morality of what is unfolding in Ukraine. A nation is being invaded because they refuse to align politically with Russia. Russia has failed to inspire using a vision that might win Kiev to its orbit and is therefore choosing to subjugate the country violently instead. Ukrainians do not deserve this, nor is it something that should be celebrated in the spirit of spiting the US that has wreaked destructive havoc of its own, nor is it something to be celebrated in a fit of hurt rage at the moral bankruptcy of Western reporters who seek to differentiate between white, Christian, they look like us refugees, and every other refugee. As the legendary Omar al-Mukhtar said, they are not our teachers. Russia has not reckoned with nor reflected on its history of brutal treatment that the Soviet Union delivered on its now former territories. And this is why there is this consistent, self-fulfilling prophecy of Russia's border states wanting to join NATO. It is because they remember that brutal history, and this is why they seek to resist Moscow. Putin's vision, his revisionist history and style of leadership facilitates the very scenario he fears, which is these states joining NATO.